you all for coming to the Wang Center in celebration of our opening reception of our current exhibition and also this afternoon lecture titled Power, Protection, Prestige, and Tribal Blanket of Southern China. My name is Jinyoung. I'm the curator and director of culture programs at the Charles B. Wang Center. Let me introduce our speaker, Chinalai, who is a co-curator of the show, and she has written numerous articles and curated several exhibitions on textile and other artifacts. And today, Chinalai will share her lifelong knowledge of many of rare and extraordinary tribal textile and their functions and their spiritual values. Please welcome Chinalai.
Thank you to Jinyoung as the co-curator and director of cultural programs for inviting us, and also her team who did everything behind the scenes and in front of the scenes. We're not even sure everything that was done, but we know photography, editing, graphic design, and installation. And thank you all for coming. I see the village of Shoreham here. Thanks a lot. I know some of you have come twice. Apologies for that, and thanks so much for coming back. And Tai Chi Masters are here. Thank you for coming. So before we head to China, I want to tell you about a buying trip that I took with a Thai friend and one of our teenage daughters sometime in the late 1990s, not directly to China, but close, to Sapa in the mountainous region of the far north of Vietnam, quite close to Yunnan province in China, and where several hill tribes lived after their predecessors migrated south across the border from China. Sapa is known as a resort town, and it may be at some time during the year, but it wasn't anything close to resort when we arrived after a freezing cold, exhaust-filled 6-hour bus ride from Hanoi. For most of the way, it was pouring rain and terribly foggy and muddy. At times, the driver would lean out the window, wipe a circle in the fogged-over windshield, and with an increasingly dirty rag. A few times he pulled over, went outside, and threw a bucket of water at the windshield. Twice, we slid into a ditch, then stood in the rain and mud while some of the able-bodied passengers helped the driver to push the bus back onto the road. We couldn't wait to arrive at our hotel, take a hot shower, and warm up. But Sapa turned out to be no different from the bus. The room we shared cost around $1.80 a night, and I would say we got less than our money's worth. It wasn't very clean, and of course, there was no heat or hot water. When it wasn't outright raining, a freezing cold mist seemed to hang in the air, coming into our bones and never leaving, indoors or out. We weren't the only ones who stayed damp and cold. Until then, to me, chilblains were something out of Victorian novels. It was the first time I had ever seen in person what chilblains were, sores and bumps on the feet from overexposure to the cold. And they were mostly on the rubber-sandaled bare feet of local hill tribe people, predominantly Hmong and Dao, whom you will meet in a bit in China as Miao and Yao. Here's a Hmong mom and her daughter in an obviously better, sunnier season. Still, in comparison to what it could have been, we lived in relative luxury. On the third day, we hiked farther up into the mountains where most of the hill tribes lived. The town of Sapa is at an elevation almost a mile high, and mountains around it extend to 10,000 feet. We each wore practically every single piece of clothing we had brought with us. I was still cold, but as a tourist wearing layers of clothes, I was able to see the forest as a place that was beautiful, lush and green and almost enchanted. As this was occurring to me, I spotted a young boy in the distance using vines and vegetation to pull himself up a steep slope with his strong, skinny arms and legs at a speed that seemed to defy gravity. I realized that the whole forest was his backyard, and to some extent, probably his family's supermarket as well. If the sun made its way through shadows of vegetation, it was rare. Scattered here and there were houses made of wood and thatch, or if a family could afford it, corrugated tin roofs. A few small openings in the homes let in the meager light and helped to let out the smoke from pails of charcoal for cooking. Inside each house, it was dark, like a basement. We passed one hut, quite close, and I peered through the entrance as unobtrusively as possible. At first, I didn't see her, but there in the dark, sitting inches from the threshold, was a woman catching whatever thin rays of light she could before the sun slipped totally behind the mountain. And she was embroidering a piece of cloth. Please keep this image in mind as you look at the extraordinary blankets in this exhibit, and you will understand how even the word extraordinary isn't adequate enough to encompass the conditions under which at least some of the bed covers may have been made. When I was checking on the current population of China, I found this webpage called Worldometer. It's live, and this is the recorded population of China on February 20th, 2022. Han Chinese people represent over 90% of China's almost 1.5 billion population, not to mention nearly 1/5 of the population of the world. This map shows in red where most of the Han population live today. Despite disruptions and changing borders throughout China's history, today's map reflects quite closely where Han people lived during the Han Empire, the period around 2,000 years ago for which they were named. The rest of the population, 55 state-designated ethnic minorities, total around 125 million, with the majority living in the South and Southwest China. The areas that are green and purple, not including Tibet, that are outlined in red and the focus of our exhibit. Tibet had not been taken over by China at the time that the blankets in our exhibit were made and is not included in this talk or the exhibit. Provinces considered part of South and Southwest China from mid-19th to mid-20th century are outlined here in red. The various tribal populations in southern China may live together in specific regions or be spread out through multiple provinces. There is a concentration of Miao people in Guizhou, for example, but the Miao people also live in 8 other provinces. By the same token, one province may be home to many different tribal groups. I think here I have to state that other than Tai Chi and Ting Butong, I don't speak Chinese, and I apologize in advance for any mispronunciations, especially of the names of the tribal groups. On the other hand, the tribes were named and renamed over the course of centuries through changes in dynasties and through changes in location brought about by forced migrations. So few of the tribal people called themselves by the names assigned to them by the Chinese government. In a sense, adding insult to injury, in the 1950s, not long after China became the People's Republic of China, the state sent scores of anthropologists out into the southern countryside to identify, group, and classify the tribes according to language, territory occupied, and common economy and culture. The problem was that not all of the tribal communities fit all of these criteria. For the most part, this was ignored by party leadership, and 55 ethnicities were decreed. Some groups who didn't even speak the same language were lumped together, and others who met all 4 criteria for belonging together were labeled separately. After a while, and with no small amount of confusion, many of the tribes began to use the names that had been imposed on them. This and assimilation into Han culture have blurred boundaries that at one time distinguished the tribes not only from the Han, but from each other. Another problem was that some names, as written by Han officials, even before the 1950s, included a radical for the word dog, a not so subtle way of implying that the members of the tribe were no better than dogs, and therefore inferior to the Han majority. Here's an example. On the left is the Chinese character from before 1930 for Yao, one of the largest tribal groups. It was changed sometimes later to the character on the right, which contains the radical for jade, an auspicious and respectful correction. In some respects, the government is trying. To make matters more complicated, almost all of the tribes have subgroups. The Yao, for example, have 90 subgroups, all with different names. The Yi, 112. Sometimes the subgroups are referred to by outsiders by the clothing they wear. like red yao for the red headcloth the women wear over their headdresses. All of this is to say that some of the names I will be mispronouncing are those assigned to people who may have called themselves something entirely different in their own language, especially at the time that the blankets in the exhibit were made. In addition, one name may be spelled several different ways in English. For simplicity, we had to choose one. While all of the southern tribal groups produced pretty wonderful textiles, the focus was often on their clothing and not always on making blankets. The 11 tribes noted here in red held the weavers of their blankets in great esteem, and these are the ones represented in the exhibit. Over time, the relationship between the tribal groups and the Han, both Han people and the Han-dominated government, impacted every aspect of the tribe's way of life, including the production of their textiles. I knew very little about this when we were first buying textiles in China. What opened my eyes was a tapestry very similar to this one that my husband, Bishai, found in Guizhou province sometime in the 1990s. For some of you, this will look familiar, and especially from before and from today. We had been buying tribal textiles in China before then for quite some time. Until that day, the clothing and blankets we found all had a distinctive tribal feel that came from the ways in which they were produced, the materials available, and the recognizable patterns and iconography. Many also were featured in tourist-oriented picture books, published under the auspices of the Chinese government and tending to have superficial information and the same photographs in all of them. We spent a lot of money on a lot of books to look at the same things. Not the greatest, but at least some source material from which to identify the various textiles' origins. But this tapestry was something else. It looked like a treasure from the royal palace in Beijing, but not quite. It wasn't as finely embroidered, lacked metallic threads, and it had a tribal flavor that started with the separation of the cloth into 3 narrow panels that most likely were done on a backstrap body tension loom, like this one, which limited the width and never would have been used in place of an elaborate standing loom in the capital. We were told, in fact, that this unusual tapestry belonged to a tribal group in Hainan called the Li. I'm Li, L-E-E, they're Li, L-I. I was filled with curiosity, so with the same Thai friend from the trip to Vietnam and a very loud translator, I went to Hainan, just south of Guangdong province in China. Hainan is a large island off the southwestern coast of Guangdong province. On the map, notice the mountain ranges in the south. These days, Hainan is a resort area with attractive beaches, but the fertile coastal areas and lowlands have always been a rich source of farmland and fishing. This is where over 5 million Han Chinese live, whereas many of the 38 tribal groups living on the island, the majority Li, are more likely to occupy the interior towns or live in the Li Mother and Five Finger Mountains, which rise almost vertically to over 4,000 feet. What we learned in Hainan was that the Li had been known for centuries for the quality of their cotton and for their exceptional weaving and embroidery. We discovered that the tapestries were called lungpei, or dragon covers, and that, as we had suspected, they were neither imperial nor tribal, but a bit of both. And while no one knows for certain exactly how they came about, the logical theory proposed to us by Tsai Yu Liang, a Han Chinese artist, writer, and collector we met in the capital, is that during the late Ming to Qing dynasties, the central government sent prototype drawings to local officials in Hainan, who then demanded that the Li copy them in silk embroidery on woven cotton to be sent back to the court as tribute. Further investigation, including a talk with the assistant curator at the Sanya Folk Custom Museum, revealed that in secret, Li weavers also made dragon covers for themselves. The very thought of this is filled with intrigue. If true, they had to collect the materials over time and probably worked only at night by lantern or candlelight. If the hidden tapestries, which contained royal symbols and should have been destined for the court, were discovered by the ruling Han, the Li who made or used them would have been in serious trouble. And the assistant director we met was Li herself. She grew up on Hainan. She had never heard of the tapestries until she began to work in the museum and found them there. Once completed, the dragon covers would have been used clandestinely and probably only in the most vital ceremonies, including as blankets to cover the deceased during a funeral. We believe that this dragon cover, which you will find outside or you've already found outside, is an example of a tapestry placed on the coffin, though that doesn't preclude its use in other ceremonies, for instance, weddings. Notice the two cranes in the upper corners of the indigo center. Since ancient times, the crane has been loved as a symbol of noble character and longevity throughout China, and also of love and fidelity in marriage. In imperial periods, crane motifs were used on the robes of civil officials to signal their ranks. Many believed that it was the crane who carried their spirit to heaven. Most Li, who already revered the dragon, would have understood and probably adopted the Han symbolism on their dragon covers as well. So the presence of two cranes seems to affirm the use of this particular longbei to cover the deceased during a Li funeral. In Li belief, then, cranes and dragons together were a kind of double insurance against unsettled ghosts. Here are some photos of what living was like for Li people in the 1930s from a book by a German anthropologist, Hans Stubel, one of the earliest we know of written about them. Although Stubel studied the Li for several years, there is not a single photo or mention of the dragon covers in this book. In fact, barely anyone knew of their existence, as I said, and as Vishai said earlier with the art crawl, until the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, when Red Guards ransacked Li homes and burned every dragon cover they could find. Over the centuries, there was a recurring push by the central Chinese government to expand control of all of the outer reaches of the empire, not just Hainan, but all of central and southern China. Waves of Han Chinese from the north were sent south by the government or went on their own, drawn by opportunities for land ownership and trade, including trade in cloth woven by the tribes. As Han officials, soldiers, and traders moved in, tribal people were pushed, sometimes by coercion and sometimes with violence, farther south, away from the rich plains and rivers in central China, southward and upward into the mountains. In Hainan, as the Han moved in, bolstered by official sanction, backed by the military, and empowered by a sense of their own superiority, often, they forced the Li away from the fertile coast and up into the unforgiving mountains in the southern half of the island. This license to encroach on Li settlements was fed by promulgating a viewpoint that the natives were stupid, ignorant barbarians. One local Han administrator was quoted as saying, "The Li drank through their noses." I was shocked additionally to find in a 1938 article in National Geographic entitled "Among the Big Knot Loi or Li of Hainan" that the Li were referred to as men with tails. The writer also noted the Han viewpoint that Li who lived closer to the coast and adopted Han ways were considered cooked, while others farther away from the towns were considered ripe. Those Li living at higher altitudes and retaining more of their own culture were not cooked or ripe, they were raw. The article simply referred to them as wild aborigines. The largest migrations of the Han and greatest pressure on the Li took place during the 16th and 17th centuries. So imagine if the Li were weaving the dragon covers during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, as we suspect, it could have been under the harshest of living conditions. I didn't know it then, but Hainan would turn out to be a microcosm of the history of the relationship between the Han Chinese and many of China's other tribal people as well. And this history would be reflected in subtle and often abstract ways in their textiles. To a great extent, the higher up in the mountains a tribal family or community was forced to go, the the more isolated they became. And it was this living remotely from the Han, and even from other tribes, that both protected and impoverished them, but also helped to preserve their culture and the artistic expression of their culture, like the blankets. So I'd like to pause here and ask all of you, or any of you, what does a blanket mean to you? Anyone volunteer to answer? Gail? Comfort and warmth. Anybody else? Protection. It's great. So, for example, how many of you had a favorite blanket as a toddler? Or a toddler with a favorite blanket? Does this tell you that there's something magical about blankets that even little children understand? No doubt, blankets keep us warm. In tribal cultures, blankets may be worn as wraps during the day and used as quilts at night. In the high altitudes of the mountains, blankets save lives. But a blanket also confers status, whether it's a name brand in a high-quality material that announces, intentionally or not, that we have the money to buy such an expensive item, or a chieftain's wrap designed to command a response that might range from respect to awe. The respect for women from many of the Chinese ethnicities was intrinsically tied to the blankets. The more expensive or difficult to obtain the materials to make them, and the more exceptional a woman's skill in producing them, the greater would be her social status. Daughters learned how to weave from their mothers, who learned from their mothers, going back hundreds and possibly thousands of years. Depending on local custom, girls usually began to weave between the ages of 8 and 14. In some cultures, a young woman was expected to have at least 4 impressive blankets finished before her wedding. You will see in the exhibit blankets that were part of a young woman's dowry. These showcased her ability, implied virtue, made her more desirable in marriage, and gained her the respect of the community, including her future parents-in-law. We all hope for that, including a prospective son-in-law who ate chicken feet in order to gain the respect of his future father-in-law. The tremendous significance of blankets in a woman's dowry is illustrated by this tightly woven bed cover. A weaving like this, possibly this very one, might have been the master bed cover that was displayed by the Tujia bride at her wedding for all of the attendees to see and judge. It exemplifies that the blankets went beyond beauty and function. Before the wedding, it was customary during negotiation between the bride's and groom's families to exchange gifts. And these would have included bed covers. And of course, the wedding was also one occasion for gift giving. In some groups, a special applique blanket, like either of these from the Buyi tribe, was presented specifically as a cover for the wedding bed. In the bed cover on the left, there is a stylized version of the lily called in Buyi culture the bringer of sons. That would be right there, and repeated. In this version, the flower is almost anthropomorphic, and I would venture that this is not a coincidence. The bed cover on the right is also filled with abstract snakes surrounding each of the diamonds and all of the lilies. And the snake was the precursor to the dragon, a totem also believed to bring sons. In Buyi terminology, the terminology for giving birth is to a boy is having a dragon. This is one of the more literal blankets from the Tujia people. But the more you look, the more you see the abstract geometry in it as well. In fact, while my daughter Donnie was helping to work on the images, she spotted the geometric shape in each horse's belly and pointed out to me that each horse was carrying a baby. The horse, emblem of strength and freedom, on this bed cover also became a symbol of fertility and abundance. Aside from weddings, blankets figured into a variety of ceremonies and rituals from birth to death, including their use as shrouds, as you saw with the dragon cover. Of course, other textiles and objects, clothing, jewelry, religious texts, paintings, carvings, and musical instruments played a role as well. For instance, early bronze drums, known as rain drums, were considered sacred by several of the tribes. They believed the sound of the beaten drum brought life-giving rain and provided a way to communicate with the ancestors. Because the drum was treasured, the pattern on its top sometimes found its way onto a bed cover, like on a batik cotton bed cover from the Dong people. Not only do the blankets provide protection from the cold, as Joan said, they were believed to provide psychic protection. Almost all are filled with patterns and iconography that pay respect to the ancestors and guard against evil or harm. They're a vehicle for wrapping oneself in the supernatural, a kind of talisman to invoke magic and cosmic blessings for good luck, prosperity, happiness, abundance, and fertility in the fields and in the bed. Which brings us to some of my favorite bed covers. All the blessings on the full-sized bed covers are passed to the children on special blankets made just for them. In some of the tribes, it was customary for family and friends to give pieces of fabric to a new mother for her to sew together into a blanket called 100 families for her new baby. The blanket in the lower right-hand corner, which contains squares of cloth we recognize as coming from a Miao woman's skirt, may be an example of this. See if I can hit the laser without advancing this one. All of the Chinese tribal blankets are the nonverbal narratives and keepers of each tribe's unique identity and culture. They convey not only a tribe's history, but help to preserve its myths and legends. Important to all the tribes is the story of their creation, which often involves real or mythical animals and great transformations. Miao people, for instance, believe they are descended from the marriage of a butterfly and a water bubble. For this reason, there are often butterflies on Miao textiles, like on this indigo-dyed batik child's cotton blanket. Part of the reason a tribe's origin story is so important is that almost without exception, worship of the ancestors is a vital element in religious and shamanistic practices. The ancestors are never forgotten. They are respected, they are worshipped, sometimes they are feared. Their help is often solicited, and their approval, determined by divination, is necessary for any ritual to proceed to culmination. Although I've rarely seen this mentioned in relation to the Chinese tribal bed covers, I believe that the diamond, an ostensibly simple geometric shape, represents genealogy. Diamonds seem to appear on nearly all of the southern tribes' blankets. Series of diamonds create connected straight or curved X's, and above, below, and to the sides of them, you often find small circles or other smaller diamonds. This idea isn't mine. It comes from a book called Patterns That Connect by Carl Schuster and Edmund Carpenter. This is how the authors frame it. Quote, "Every pattern shows every tribal member, living and dead, unalterably linked together. Stepped figures, reduced to a few lines, look non-representational, geometric, abstract. In some figures, the abstraction comes from not at first seeing the figures. But once you start to extract them, you also will start to see them almost everywhere. There are also figures within figures, much like the wooden Russian nesting dolls, like this. Diagonally intersecting lines form arms and legs, with one side representing the mother and the other the father, joined together to create the child. The limbs are, quote, indistinguishably fused, and the observer is lost in an anatomical puzzle. But the confusion is deliberate, a graphic representation of the puzzle of procreation itself, unquote. Like a family tree, diamonds in horizontal rows signifying living relatives, those diagonally above, the parents, and those diagonally below, the children. Of course, the parents are also children, and the children parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on, back into tribal history. If this messes with your mind the way it does mine, look at the two hourglass-shaped figures here, and imagine there are the same figures to the left and bottom. Then picture the hexagon the four figures create in the negative space at center. You'll see many hexagons on the blankets in the exhibit as well. And when I was writing the signs for the exhibit, I was able to look up and kind of imagine a lot of the iconography of the figures and the patterns on the textiles, but the hexagons defeated me until I went back to the patterns that connect and realized that they're very much part of the pattern that's formed by various diamonds. When you leave the Wang Center tonight, glance down at the pattern on the road out front also. Around the same time that the civil anthropologists were sectioning off the various tribes into the 55 groups that I mentioned before, the Chinese government was setting up autonomous administrative regions to be run in varying degrees by tribal leaders. In a 2017 article in the People's Daily Online, obviously a state publication, the author writes, "It can safely be said that the policies have largely succeeded, given that the country has remained relatively stable and relations between the various ethnic groups have been quite harmonious." He continues, "Ethnic autonomy has been practiced in China for over 60 years, though the country has been a united multi-ethnic state of over 2,000 years." Yes, well, clearly this is a subject for another talk, but two things stand out in relation to this one. One is that the government's conception of help and harmony for the non-Han ethnicities is to bring them into the fold. That is, to work toward assimilating them into Han culture so that, from the Han perspective, every aspect of their lives can improve. At the same time, the government seems to be encouraging retention of tribal cultures and has set up fake tribal villages in many of the southern provinces directed towards the tourist industry, and hired the tribal people to wear their ethnic costumes and perform ceremonies, especially those with lots of singing and dancing. That is, perform rather than celebrate. If you watch some of these performances on YouTube, look at the people's faces, and they will tell you a lot. The second thing is that assimilation isn't necessarily a negative if it brings greater educational and economic opportunities and greater power and prestige. So there's a tension that has been introduced into tribal communities between those who want to be modern, like the dominant Han, and those who regret the ongoing loss of the old ways. Eric Boudreau, an author living in Guizhou, and Christopher Buckley, a textile scholar, write about the tribe's weaving technologies, that things changed dramatically in the 1990s as a result of women from 18 to 40 leaving their villages for factories along China's coastal areas, virtually emptying the villages of an entire generation. They write, weft patterning looms were discarded and the practice of weaving has been entirely lost except for a few isolated pockets. Assimilation and the easy availability of commercial fabrics means, of course, that the transmission of weaving knowledge between generations is in total decline, except when the government sponsors the production and selling of stitched and woven ethnic items, which, needless to say, has caused the blankets and other tribal textiles to lose both their meaning and spontaneity. A woven bed cover these days is more likely to be ordered in twin, queen, and king sizes. You can see how ancient and traditional iconography have transferred to contemporary machine-made blankets, flowers, fish, spirals, or possibly the antennae of a butterfly here, are all present, as are the characters for double happiness, the phoenix, and the dragon. From the outside, from people who love old tribal textiles, this feels like a terrible loss. But who are we to judge? When I was working on this talk, Jinyoung sent me photographs of the exhibit as it was being installed. I looked at my name on the gigantic banner by the entrance and complained to a friend, only half joking, how am I going to live up to that? To my surprise, my friend, an experienced writer and lecturer, responded to my unjoking half. She advised, decide what is the one thing you want people to take away from your talk. Focus and build around that. I thought about that a lot, but there was the whole history of each individual tribe and of the geopolitical relationship between each tribe and the Han and the Chinese imperial and secular governments to describe. There are textiles in ancient history that were the seed references for many of the blankets you see here today. There was the beauty and complexity of each blanket, which are only touched upon by these very few on display. There are the weaving, sewing, and dyeing techniques, the looms, and the materials, which we didn't have time to discuss at all, and the history, beliefs, legends, mythologies, and iconography embedded in each pattern. To zero in on only one thing and build around that, well, honestly, that defeated me. But there is one thing that I hoped you would take away from my talk and this exhibit, so I'm just going to say it. It's that people are resilient. That difficult, challenging, and sometimes unbearable circumstances can feed rather than destroy creativity. That the drive to create, especially as exemplified in tribal art from earlier times when what motivated people was not commercial value, that drive almost always originated from a certain purity and integrity. And as much as we might like to credit by name the various artists who made these fascinating blankets, when the goal is to make something worthy, anonymity can be just as good as, and sometimes even better than fame, though not necessarily better than recognition. And finally, that creative resilience comes in all forms, not just in what we produce, but in how we live our lives. I'm done.
Around the microphone.
Yeah, highly. It's
Hi,
just astonishing collection. I have two questions. One of them is that often one would see a repetitive pattern on several different stripes, but they were never lined up. Is there some reason they weren't lined up?
So if you remember the woman
Talk
weaving-
into the mic, please.
I'm sorry, what?
The microphone.
Oh, thank you. Do you remember the woman sitting with her legs out, holding the loom? It was wrapped around her back. The textile that could be produced could only be as wide as her body. And therefore, when you'll notice in a lot of the blankets that they're in sections. So the section was woven, and the next section was woven, and the really skilled weaver, if she cared, would try to match the pattern and have it continue. But it didn't always work. And those sections, either 2, 3, or sometimes 4, would then be often framed in other cotton, usually cotton textiles, and that's why. But, it depended on whether she cared.
Okay, second question that you, at the end, you said you weren't going to talk about materials much, but I mean, among carpets and weaving, there are two choices, animal or vegetable. What were we seeing there?
When you say, you mean chemical or vegetable? Animal or vegetable?
Yeah, was
okay.
it wool or were they these plant
great.
fibers?
So, yes, when you go out and see the exhibit, the signs will identify the materials, but mostly what you're seeing is cotton. It was either foraged or planted. And when a tribal person could afford it, or when the ceremony merited the attention of the expense, then you would have silk introduced. Okay. But there's also bast fibers, plant fibers, I don't think there's anything. There are some textiles that are pounded with ox blood or pig's blood, but I'm trying to think in this exhibit. I don't think there are any that you're going to see. So vegetable.
All right.
Thanks for the questions.
Any other questions? Joanne?
I'm looking at the extraordinary, beauty of these blankets, and unfortunately I didn't make it in time for the walk around. So, are there stories that come with the blankets? Do they show people this blanket and say this is about this topic that conveys something about the culture?
Yeah, almost always. They might incorporate the origin story of the tribes. They might incorporate mythology. Certainly they're filled with symbols. The patterns are meaningful. Now, I'd never studied anthropology as a major, but I studied Asian studies, and anthropology was one of the classes that I took. And one thing that always stuck with me was that anthropologists love to write an article, and then somebody refutes everything that they've said, and then somebody refutes what the other person refuted. And I think that there's some disagreement about whether, for example, my feeling is that the diamond shapes represent the ancestors for so many of the tribes. Some people just say they represent the mountains, they're a fence, they're geometric, period. I think that probably all of those things are true at various stages in the evolution of a tribe's history. There have been items that we've studied. For example, a necklace I almost wore that has etching on it from the Hmong people who are Miao in China. And the patterns on them are very, very similar to textiles. And I wanted to write an article about them. So I went to northern Thailand and I met with Hmong people at a community center. They were all pretty young, and not a single one of them had any idea what the meaning was of the pattern on the piece of jewelry. So then I said, okay, I want to meet your parents and I want to meet your grandparents. And so we got in a car and we went out to the villages to meet the elders. And some of them gave an answer and some of them couldn't. So where's the truth? The truth for the young people was that the patterns were just patterns, but they were traditional and they were passed down and they were meaningful because it was part of the history of that tribe. But for some people, it held a much deeper meaning because they remembered. So all of that is in danger of being lost, which is why we try to study and why we've written some articles and, why other people write wonderful books and, Good question. Thanks.
One more question before
Over
we
there,
move to the
Jinyoung?
reception.
Yeah.
Since we are recording, can you use the microphone?
Hello. Okay. So my question is that you mentioned before that I think it was the Li people that would send their textiles to court, right?
Yes.
Okay. So how significant of an export was that for those people? Did they receive, how important was that particular agreement with the courts in China for those people and their development?
If the theory is correct, because we have not met anyone except this one author, collector, painter in Hainan, in the capital, who has a different theory. And the museum people seem to go along with it. If that theory is correct, that this was tribute, then the Li people were coerced into doing this. This was not something that they wanted to do, but China, the central government in China had a history of collecting tribute from all over the country. It was a form of tax. I doubt if they received any kind of compensation for any of it except for the textiles that they hid away and kept for themselves. And there's a textile in Lee culture called a ghost cover that, I believe, preceded the dragon covers. And from just a little bit of information here and there, I think that the dragon covers took over some of the functions of the ghost covers, which I don't know for what reason they stopped being made. It's possible that the skill was lacking. They were mostly woven, they weren't embroidered, and quite complicated. So that may be what happened. It would have been nice if they got some reward from it, other than hiding what they did. Yeah. Thanks for the question. It's good.
I have one more.
Great.
Did the blanket serve as any medium or form of gift giving between the different cultures in southern China? So between one people and another?
It's a good question, and I would say probably when there was intermarriage among the tribes, for sure. In general, it probably varied a lot depending on how high up on the mountain a group lived. The higher the altitude, the more isolated they were. The more isolated they were, the more involved in their own culture they would have been. So as they came down the mountain lower and lower and lower, the whole life got not just interrelated with other tribal groups, but especially with the Han Chinese, who just had, especially in the minds of a lot of the younger people, so much more to offer on occasion. I attended a Yao wedding in northern Thailand, and I was sitting with a bunch of young men on the third day of this wedding that we missed 2 days of. And I was a very tired bride and groom, I have to tell you. And the young men were telling me how much better the Thai culture was, and not only that, how much better the Christian church was than their own religion. And I asked them, you know, what about the Christian church is so attractive to you? And they said, well, look at this wedding. This has been going on for 5 days. We've killed how many pigs? It was very expensive. It's hurting our parents because they had to invest so much money. The rituals are ridiculous. Everybody stops work. I mean, they sounded very modern and very divorced from the culture. And they go to the church and they get gifts, and the service is quick, and it's fine. And so I asked them, well, when you get gifts, what do they want back from you? And they said, nothing. And I said, well, do they want you to be Christian? And they said, oh, well, yeah. And I said, well, that's what they want in return. So getting gifts is fine. Being Christian is fine if that's what you want to be. But don't become Christian because they give you gifts. So that was just one example of how things have changed over the years. Thanks.
Thank you so much for tuning in to the lecture. We'll continue our celebration at the Skylight Gallery. You can look at the individual textile we're exhibiting, and we can continue our conversation with Lee and Vishai. So thank you all for coming, and we're going to continue.
Thank you.